Who do we say that Jesus is? Are we willing to take up our cross and follow him? Or are we chasing things of the world and losing our souls? Are we ashamed of Jesus? Let's discuss this in Mark 8. Did a great crowd have anything to eat after 3 days with Jesus? Was Jesus concerned about their welfare? In those days, when there was a very great multitude, and they had nothing to eat, Jesus called his disciples to himself, and said to them, I have compassion on the multitude, because they've stayed with me now for 3 days, and have nothing to eat. If I send them away fasting to their home, they'll faint on the way, for some of them have come a long way. Were the disciples only looking at a physical solution? Again, did Jesus have a divine solution? His disciples responded, How can anyone get enough food in this wilderness to satisfy these people? Jesus asked, How much bread do you have? They said 7 loaves. He told the crowd to sit on the ground. He took the 7 loaves, gave thanks, broke them apart, and gave them to his disciples to distribute, and they gave the bread to the crowd. Similar to feeding the 5,000, what did Jesus do? What did Jesus do after that? They also had a few little fish, and after Jesus had blessed these, he told the disciples to pass them around. The crowd of about 4,000 people ate all they wanted, and the leftovers filled 7 large baskets. As soon as Jesus had sent the people away, he got into the boat with the disciples and crossed to the territory near Dalmanutha. Did the Pharisees begin to argue with Jesus? Would God give a sign to such a generation of unbelievers? The Pharisees came and began to argue with him, seeking from him a sign from heaven to test him. And he sighed deeply in his spirit and said, Why does this generation seek a sign? Truly I say to you, no sign will be given to this generation. And he left them, got into the boat again, and went to the other side. Did the disciples completely miss Jesus' intended meaning because they were only thinking materially? Do we? They'd forgotten to take bread and had only 1 loaf with them in the boat. Then he commanded them, Watch out! Beware of the yeast of the Pharisees and the yeast of Herod. They were discussing among themselves that they didn't have any bread. Did Jesus ask if the disciples' hearts were hardened? Do we also sometimes miss Jesus' purposes because of hard hearts? Knowing this, Jesus asked them, Why are you discussing the fact that you don't have any bread? Don't you understand or perceive yet? Are your hearts hardened? Do you have eyes but fail to see? Do you have ears but fail to hear? Don't you remember? What did Jesus remind them of? What should the 2 events have helped them understand? Do we also need to be taught the same lesson over again because of our hard hearts? When I broke the 5 loaves among 5,000, how many baskets full of fragments did you take up? They said to him, 12. And when the 7 among 4,000, how many baskets full of fragments did you take up? And they said, 7. And he said to them, How is it that you don't understand? What did Jesus do with a blind man? Did he anoint him with olive oil, or spit on his eyes and lay hands on him? And they came to Bethsaida, and they brought a blind man to Jesus, and pleaded with him to touch him. And taking the blind man by the hand, he brought him out of the village. And after spitting on his eyes and laying his hands on him, he was asking him, Do you see anything? And he looked up and was saying, I see men, for I see them like trees walking around. Then again he laid his hands on his eyes, and he looked intently and was restored, and began to see everything clearly. And he sent him to his home, saying, Don't even enter the village. Is a description of an event in the Bible always a prescription for us to follow? Is there an instruction elsewhere that's normative for the church? Let's look at James. Is anyone among you sick? Let him call for the elders of the church, and let them pray over him, anointing him with oil in the name of the Lord. Who did people say Jesus was? Who did his disciples say he was? Jesus went out along with his disciples to the villages of Caesarea Philippi, and on the way he questioned his disciples, saying to them, "Who do people say that I am?" They told him, saying, "John the Baptist, and others say Elijah, and others one of the prophets." And he continued questioning them, "But who do you say that I am?" Peter answered and said to him, "You're the Christ." And he warned them to tell no one about him. How did Peter react to the news that Jesus would suffer, be killed, and rise again? Do we also avoid suffering, not believing that it's sometimes God's will? Then he began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the teachers of the law, and that he must be killed, and after 3 days rise again. He spoke plainly about this, and Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But when Jesus turned and looked at his disciples, he rebuked Peter. "Get behind me, Satan," he said. "You don't have in mind the concerns of God, but merely human concerns." Must we be willing to deny ourselves by taking up our own cross? Are we willing to accept the will of God, however painful? When he'd called the people to himself, with his disciples also, he said to them, "Whoever desires to come after me, let him deny himself, and take up his cross, and follow me." What happens when we try to hang on to our lives? What happens if we're willing to give up our lives for Christ's sake and for the gospel? If you try to hang on to your life, you'll lose it. But if you give up your life for my sake and for the sake of the good news, you'll save it. Do those who chase worldly possessions do so at risk of losing their own souls or lives? For what does it profit a man to gain the whole world and forfeit his life? For what will a man give in exchange for his life? Are we ashamed of Christ and his teachings? What danger does that put us in? Whoever's ashamed of me and my words in this unfaithful and sinful generation, the Son of Man will be ashamed of that person when he comes in the Father's glory with the holy angels. Who do we say that Jesus is? Are we willing to take up our cross and follow him? Or are we chasing things of the world and losing our souls? Are we ashamed of Jesus? You decide.